I started working at the University of New Hampshire in 1992, and I didn't have a degree, and my husband was in the Air Force, and he finally got out of the Air Force, so we were going to be living somewhere permanently. So I managed to get a job at the University of New Hampshire at Manchester working on a 5-year federal grant. And not that it has anything to do with research ethics, but I, meanwhile, as a non-traditional student, got my bachelor's degree. And once I got my bachelor's degree, UNH promoted me, or Cooperative Extension did, to community development and 4-H youth development. So I started getting into the field of a lot of education and facilitation and working with communities. But I got, the hours were very long, and I was trying to do a master's degree too at the same time at night. And a job came up at the University of New Hampshire that said regulatory compliance manager. I said to my husband, "Now, what do you think about this?" And he works for a defense contractor, so he works with regulations all the time. He said to me, anybody can learn regulations. He said, but they're looking for the educational component. They wanted to change a compliance job into the carrot more than the stick. So they were really emphasizing educational experience. So he said, you can learn the regulations. You've got the education background. Go for it. So I applied and I got the job. And right at that time, it was managing the IRB and the IACUC. Really, that's what it was. The chair of the IRB at that time, the IRB at UNH has been in existence from the 1970s. And the chair at that time was the chair of the education department. And he was absolutely wonderful. His name was Grant Chaffee, and I say was because he passed away very suddenly about 8 years ago. So Grant helped me, learn the regulations. I was hired on September the 22nd. I came to a primer in San Diego for IRB. And then the next spring, I came to a primer in San Diego for an IACUC. And that was within the first 6 months, that's how I learned, by doing IACUC 101 and IRB 101. And after that, a year went by, and Grant said to me, you should really apply for the PhD program. And as a student at UNH, an employee, education is free. So he was the chair of the education department. He said, I'll write you a letter, just apply. And I got into the PhD program in education. 5 years later, I got my PhD. He was my advisor. And working on the IRB, I teach a lot of graduate students in various things. And I say one of them is, when you do a dissertation, do something that you are passionate about, because you live, eat, breathe, sleep this topic for 2, 5, 7 years, however long it takes you. And first of all, when I went into the program, I thought it was all going to be quantitative. And then I took a qualitative research methods class, and my eyes were opened, so to speak, I hate to say that, to a very different way of doing research. And I ended up doing a qualitative dissertation, phenomenological dissertation, on the research ethics, the relationship between ethnographers and their relationships with their research participants. So I did a research study on researchers about the ethics of research relationships. So it was in qualitative research. And so this was what really, it tied my work to my studies, and it was very symbiotic. And so it advanced not only my work on the IRB, but it also helped my PhD work. And so, and all through that, Grant was my advisor and my dissertation chair. I was also very lucky to have on my dissertation Irv Seidman, who is now emeritus from UMass Amherst, who is one of the, he has a book that's kind of the book, the interviewing book for phenomenological research. And so I managed to get him on my dissertation committee. And so it was a beautiful experience where I learned so much about research ethics, all the while learning and doing research in a qualitative manner, but also helping my work on the IRB too. When I went to apply for the job 15 years ago of regulatory compliance manager, and that's what they called it back then, I really didn't know anything about research, nothing. And so the job was run the IRB, run the IACUC. And at the time, it was the NIH implementation of the regulations, or the policy on responsible conduct of research, which as soon as the Bush administration came in, canned the policy, so it never went into effect. But at UNH, our vice president for research was very forward thinking and thinking, well, isn't this something we should be doing? So he actually pushed the institution to keep going on a path for responsible conduct of research education. So that is also in my job description now, which human subjects is just a piece of that. If you compare the animal use regulations with the human subjects regulation, there's probably 4 times. And when you think about it, at first it seems a little striking, but then as somebody said to me very succinctly, well, the animals really can't say no. And so that put it in a nutshell. But I think there are a lot of aspects of the human regulations that are very lacking, and particularly in the area of people who do not have the capacity to consent. I really think we have the subparts for pregnant women, for neonates, for prisoners, and for children, but I really, really see a subpart on people who do not have the capacity to consent as lacking, because they're a very important research population, but they're definitely very vulnerable. We see a lot of research at UNH. We have a center very near us in Portsmouth who works with people with brain injury, and there's all kinds of populations around. And I just think that looking at the history of human research, protections or ethics or abuses or however you want to frame it, the decisionally impaired are so vulnerable. And particularly if you get researchers who don't have the best mindset, I think it's a population that really, and again, you don't want to impose on their autonomy, but I think they really need to be protected. We are a research-intensive institution, but we don't have a medical school, we don't have a vet school. We now have a law school, but that really doesn't impact those areas of research. So we have a fairly high volume that you need policies and all this, but you don't have enough volume that it's enough for 2 full-time positions. So I wear many hats, and those are just 2 of them. I also do financial conflict of interest. I also run the Responsible Conduct of Research program. For me, I have the person who runs HIPAA. I have a lawyer who works for me who does HIPAA. She also does export controls and compliance with somebody else. What I love about the position is every day is different. Sometimes it's frustrating because everybody wants something of you and they think that, a lot of people would look at me and say, oh, you're the IRB administrator and that's all you do. It's like, actually, no. If you talk to somebody else, I'm wearing a different hat and a different hat. But I have so much variation in my job and I learn so much on a daily basis and it's all different that luckily I am of a personality and a disposition that I'm very organized, which is a good thing and not a good thing. So I can handle it all. And it does get challenging, but I love the learning because I learn so much. And I love working with students, particularly graduate students. They're like ripe. It's that position. I also teach a class in the fall semester, Ethics in Research and Scholarship. It's an interdisciplinary class seminar, and I teach it with a microbiologist. And we just love it. The most important thing that I do is probably the IRB. It takes up most of my time. If I have to say of all the things I'm responsible for, the IRB takes up most of my time. It's probably a good 50% of my time. And I think it's because it affects people's daily lives, where I'm not to say that the animals aren't important, but there are many protections in place. And I have a veterinarian and animal tech staff who work for us. And there's lots of people taking care of animals and all the rest of it. But humans, I think they're much more vulnerable in that somebody can send out a survey. Somebody can do interviews, and unless those are the oversight of it, much as I love the thought of strengthening the common rule, I really see the pushing social science out of it as extremely short-sighted. And to think that every interview, every survey is benign and minimal risk, I think is extremely naive. They just need to come and look at our IRB protocols. We have a Crimes Against Children research lab. That just the title of the research lab says it all. We have a fair number of protocols about sexual violence on campus. So there are a lot of vulnerable people, not as in vulnerable with a capital V in that they fall under a subpart, but the topics, the nature, and if the IRB isn't involved and you don't have experienced, or I don't want to say not responsible researchers, but if they're not clued into what's going on, then I think it's a very important role of the IRB to make sure that those protections are in place without being paternalistic and without altering researchers' protocols to the extent that they can't do their research. We're very collaborative. I actually have a wonderful IRB, and we actually have a waiting list of people who want to be on our IRB, which I think is pretty unique. We have people who've been on the IRB for 30 years because they just love it. And again, change is good, but there's also good for continuity, so there's a balance. We very much encourage researchers to contact us with questions. We actually had a researcher about 2 weeks ago saying, this is a study I'm proposing. I don't know if the IRB will let me do it. And we're like, well, of course we'll talk about it, you know. And so she said, this is the rationale for this is the rationale for that. And so the IRB chair and I read the 2 or 3 articles she sent, the email, then we met with her and her grad students for half an hour and said, these are the things you need to address. And I don't think we're going to tell you can't do it. You just need to make sure that you've addressed the issues, deception and this and that. And so it's a very collaborative model. Our IRB reviews about 250 new protocols a year, and I've been doing this for 15 years, and there's only one that we have not approved. And that was, it went to 3 full board meetings. So that was, it was reviewed, revised, came back, revised, reviewed, revised, came back. Another IRB member and I met with the researcher for an hour. She revised it again and came back. And at that point, the IRB said, you do not get the fundamental issue. And it involved severely disabled children in a classroom setting and video recording. And somehow there was this huge disconnect between the researcher and what the IRB. So we actually came down and said, this is not approved. We voted. And that's the only time in 15 years we've not approved a protocol, versus you propose something, we review it and say, these are the things we'd like you to address. So you address them, and there are some more things. And you address them. Very rarely is it more than 2 backwards and forwards. And so this was a seminal case for us, and this was last year. So I think that if you look at the numbers, and I actually think if you talk to a lot of our researchers, much that they might not like to go through the IRB process conceptually or it's just philosophically, hopefully most of them would agree that we're fairly reasonable and we are very amenable to conversation. We require IRB approval for honors theses at the institution. And so if you have got an undergraduate who is looking to do an honors thesis, they're more serious about their research than an undergraduate who's just trying to get a degree. So we require it at that level. And then I would say graduate school is your next stop. Graduate classes, even at the master's level, there are differences between professionals degrees and more research degrees, and maybe not the professional degrees, depending again what they're doing. But if you're going to do a thesis, I think very important. And then our UNH, our graduate council, required any incoming PhD now has to undertake responsible conduct of research training within their first semester. So every fall semester, myself and the graduate school, because I get involved in it, we train our incoming class of PhD students, which is anywhere from between 185 to 110. One session, they are required to do 11 online modules, which is about 5.5 hours total, and then an afternoon of case studies. And that's our graduate council. So that's because all of our graduate council considers a PhD a research degree. And so they figure if you are going to be doing research at this level, you need to understand. And it's not just human subjects. It's peer review, authorship, conflicts of interest. It's kind of the NIH required RCR topics plus intellectual property and what we call hazardous materials. So that's what we require of them. One of the things that I have noticed is that, of course, being the IACUC administrator and the IRB administrator, is anytime a dissertation got to the graduate school and it didn't have the requisite clearance. So at UNH, if you use animals in your dissertation or humans, you have to bind the IACUC or the IRB letter as your Appendix A. And I would say on average, I got 1 to 2 dissertations a year where the graduate school refused it because there was no approval. For whatever reason, sometimes it was bad advising. And I haven't had one of those maybe for the last 4 years. So if nothing else, it has helped that aspect, which is very serious for those students. But I think we live in the live free or die state. And so that is ingrained in the blood, I think, of everybody who works at the institution. And so regulation and policy, they're not prolific. It's when they have to be. So this way, as I'm very friendly with our associate dean of the graduate school, is if you can train the graduate students, by osmosis, the faculty get infused with this information. New faculty coming in, chances are they've had this training because of the NSF requirements and the USDA requirements and the NIH requirements. But when you get graduate students in who take this training and then they start saying to their faculty members, well, you know, we learned about authorship, and should I really be an author on this paper or collaborative research? And then it kind of, through osmosis, works its way up. Instead of trying to train faculty, which is, it's a non-starter. So it's a very subversive way of infusing research ethics throughout the research community. I'll probably get shot by any if any of the faculty at UNH watch this, but it's a very good way of getting it in, because then you have graduate students who are in these research labs, programs, or whatever, who now are in positions where they oversee undergraduates, so they can help impart it. Plus, all of our training is online and it's free to anybody. So they might say to their graduate students or their undergraduates, you know, you really need to go and take that. We're going to be doing a human subjects, or we're going to be doing something on authorship. Why don't you go and take that module, because it'll really help you. So it's just a really, really good way, I think, without having the top-down approach, because that doesn't work at our institutions, and it doesn't work at a lot of institutions too. So I think qualitative research, and that's what my dissertation was, and it was about qualitative research. So that's why I became so interested in it. And I think it's, for a lot of people, it's highly misunderstood. It's not taken as serious science by a lot of people who do quantitative research. It has such a vast opportunity for looking and answering questions that aren't answerable by quantitative research. But I think, as maybe you experienced in the conversations about those case studies, there are so many gray areas, and it's so very different that it's that people need to understand what it's about. And there are very strong traditions in qualitative research, in education. There's a whole school in sociology and psychology. The health sciences, nursing has one of the broadest literature on qualitative research ethics, and some of the other health sciences like occupational therapy and that. So I just really think that IRBs need to become educated about it if they don't. I was having, after the session, having a brief conversation with somebody who said, you know, we really have a hard time with qualitative research on our campus because we have a chair who's very quantitative, and a lot of the IRB members are, and they don't try to understand qualitative research. It's like it's not valid, or doesn't have scientific validity or merit, and therefore, and you hear the horror stories. Just read the literature. The horror stories about IRBs asking ethnographers to provide their hypothesis. You know, those kinds of things, and it's because it's something different, and we were all very busy. So it's a, you know, another whole area to learn. But there are very easy ways around it, such as recruiting qualitative researchers onto the IRB, doing just reading articles on the fundamentals of qualitative research, how to evaluate qualitative research protocols for scientific merit, those kinds of things. It doesn't have to be hard. I think what it has to be is opening your mind that there's another way of looking at things. It's like when televisions used to just be black and white, and then they went to color. I think a lot of qualitative researchers would say a quantitative question is the black and white. The qualitative question is the color. You get so much more richness because of the way the philosophical underpinnings and the way you go about a qualitative study to a quantitative study. That doesn't mean it's better or more important. It's just another way of looking at things. And I don't know if you went to the session this morning on sexual violence on campus. There was a panel of researchers, and one of them was from Columbia talking about the SHIFT study. And he was doing so it's a huge study. There's a quantitative component and a qualitative component. He's doing the ethnographic qualitative component. And he was talking about all the issues that they come up in qualitative research. And they are messy, and they take time to resolve. But it's another whole side of looking at a question or an issue that I think a lot of people would say is you can't get at the quantitative. And if that's not your, if you don't need that information, that's fine. But I think just to say that it doesn't have value because it's not the way you were trained, or it's not the way that you look at the world, or that you understand knowledge, or you understand issues, I think in an IRB world is if you've got these research protocols coming towards you, owe it to your constituents, your clients, which is what your researchers are, your customers, to make an effort to understand it so that you can review it and give it the proper due, that it's the respect that it should have. As if you're a quantitative researcher, you would expect the same as a board that reviewed primarily qualitative. So I think IRBs have come a long way with the split from biomedical to biomedical and SBRs at those institutions that have medical schools and that. But I still think that there's a long way to go from the stories that I still hear about qualitative being the soft, fuzzy kind of stuff that, really has no merit. And I think you should just look at what the NSF funds, what the foundations fund. They fund a lot of qualitative. The education department, the USDA funds qualitative research. So there is validity, it has merit, and I think really IRBs need to get on board and do due diligence on qualitative research.